Thank you so much, Lisa. I appreciate it. Welcome to the continuation of the 2024 NOAA Fisheries EBFM seminar series. The series began almost 7 years ago now, and our main objective has always been to increase awareness with respect to ecosystem-based management and highlight the progress that NOAA and its partners are making to enhance these EBM strategies. NOAA Library, as you can just heard from Lisa, continues to be our valuable co-host to the series. The seminars are offered a second Wednesday of each month from 3 to 4. Each presentation, as Lisa pointed out, is publicly accessible and recorded and archived, and she will post a link to that. Following today's presentation, there's always an opportunity to ask questions here, but also our speaker will provide their email address if you have any follow-up questions that you'd like to follow on. Thanks to many of the speakers and colleagues here at NOAA and beyond, and the attendees who join the series each month. They provide valuable feedback to us and offer many recommendations with respect to topics and speakers. And I want to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Wendy Morrison, who's been a dear colleague with me at NOAA. She's within the Office of Sustainable Fisheries and has been an active player within fisheries management and ecology. Her focus has been largely on climate change and ecosystem-based fisheries management, fisheries allocations, and catch share fisheries. So I'm going to turn the talk over to Wendy, and thank you again, Wendy, for all your efforts. And also, you're joined by Stephanie and Melissa Karp and Max Appelman and Jason Link as co-authors to this presentation. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Peg. Thank you, Lisa, for the wonderful introduction. And thanks, everybody, for being here. I'm looking forward to telling you a little bit about ecosystem level reference points. Before I leave the slide, I do want to thank you, Peg, for mentioning my co-authors on here, but I just definitely want to highlight that this was a team effort. So I will be presenting what we did together as a team. And so this presentation really walks through a review article that we put out this year. And so I will, on the second slide, show you a link to the reference for that review article if you want to see the full article. But thank you. Oop, let me figure out slides. Okay, there we go. I forgot it has a little bit of a delay. Okay, so the main goals for this session is I want to introduce you to the idea and the concept of ecosystem level reference points. We went and we did a little bit of literature search on ecosystem level reference points, and we divided the ones we found into different categories. So I want to walk you through those different categories. I'm going to talk about next steps and take homes. And see at the bottom, you can see the article that this slideshow is based on. Okay, before we start, I want to give a little bit of background. I know we have a whole series here on ecosystem-based fisheries management, but I just want to make sure everybody is on the same page about what ecosystem-based fisheries management is. So this slide shows our definition from our ecosystem-based fisheries management policy here at NOAA Fisheries. And so I'm just going to read that to you so we are all on the same page. So it's a systematic approach to fisheries management, and it's in a geographically specified area, and it contributes to the resilience and sustainability of the ecosystem. It recognizes physical, biological, economic, and social interactions among the affected fishery-related components of the ecosystem, including humans, and seeks to optimize benefits among a diverse set of societal goals. So, setting the stage there. A little bit more on setting the stage. So before we can talk about ecosystem level reference points, I want to talk a little bit about single species reference points. So what we have now and what we're hoping to move toward with ecosystem level reference points. So single species reference points, in short, are a target level of an indicator that triggers management actions. And so, for example, it could be a fishing mortality or a biomass target that we wish to achieve. That could be a reference point. It could also be some sort of limit or threshold that we want to avoid. So fishery management plans typically require management action when one of these reference points are crossed. For example, when a biological reference point is exceeded, management actions, often in the form of harvest restrictions, could be triggered to reduce mortality from fishing to more sustainable levels. So I'm going to keep going. So moving from single species we're moving towards ecosystem level reference points. And in short, ecosystem level reference points are reference points at the ecosystem level. So ecosystem indicators that have associated thresholds, targets, and lead to management action when those thresholds are crossed. And so here on the slide, I have the official definition we put in our manuscript, but that's the shorter version. And so, as I noted, we do want a management action to be triggered when you cross your ecosystem level reference point. And so, those management actions could include things like reducing ecosystem wide fishing mortality, increasing protections for maybe lower productivity stocks, adding a closed area. It could be even just implementing a new monitoring system, looking at an area of the ecosystem you're concerned about, or any other appropriate management action that makes sense based on your ecosystem. So right up front, I'm going to tell you my take homes. So that way, as we're going through the rest of this presentation, you can really be pondering and say, is she showing us that? Do I believe these take homes? But so here they are up front. I think, we think, the authors on this think that ecosystem level reference points are a wonderful and a great step towards ecosystem-based fisheries management. We believe there is sufficient information and good reasons for management to begin implementing them now. And I also would like to push that I hope that managers think outside the box when looking at your ecosystem and trying to consider what could be potential ecosystem level reference points for your ecosystem. And I'm sure there's some ideas or categories that we did not even identify. So just think about, what are you concerned with your ecosystem, and is there a way you can identify an indicator, a threshold, and an appropriate management response? Okay, a little more background, and then I'll dive into the different categories. So to be clear, ecosystem level reference points are not currently required or mandated, but they are included as something in our ecosystem-based fisheries management roadmap. So NOAA Fisheries in 2016 put out an ecosystem policy and an ecosystem based fisheries management roadmap that are the actions we will take to meet the ideas in our policy. So the first of the policy and roadmap were put out in 2016, and then hot off the presses, just last week, we put out an updated ecosystem-based fisheries management roadmap. If you listened to last month's seminar, that's what Yvonne presented on. So you also have that as a resource, a little bit of information on our updated roadmap. At the bottom of this slide, I have the link. And non-NOAA folks, I would love for your guys' input on this, the updated roadmap, and we are out for public comment until July. But within both of the original roadmap and the updated roadmap, we do mention ecosystem level reference points. And I will note that this is one of the, since it's not required, this is an aspirational. This is where we want to be. We want to move towards ecosystem level reference points. Why? Why do we think it's important to consider ecosystem level reference points? They're important for the points we have here. They're good for monitoring how the ecosystem is functioning at a higher level. So if you're just looking at single species management through time, you might be missing a higher level change that's going on. So maybe multiple stocks are having a decrease in productivity at the same time. That might suggest there's a change in productivity at the ecosystem level. We want to be able to identify those as early as we can when they happen. So that's the second bullet, provide early warnings of major changes. They also can help discussions around trade-offs and balance competing objectives you have within fisheries management. So for example, if you decrease your fishing mortality on predators and have more predators out in the ecosystem, that will affect the productivity and number of prey you have. And you may need to also adjust your fishing mortality on your prey. So there's trade-offs across fisheries management. And then also, ecosystem level reference points can help us understand ecosystem changes. And I think this is really important to help with shifting baseline syndrome. Let me go to the next slide. So shifting baseline syndrome, I admit I don't really like this picture here. I think it's a little bit too much and a little bit too dramatic in the changes that it's showing, but it shows you the idea of shifting baseline. So it's extreme, and just forgive me, it's what I could find online, and I give credit to the person who created it. But what shifting baseline is, it describes a gradual change in our accepted norms and expectations for the environment across generations. Our tolerance for environmental degradation increases and our expectations for the natural world can be lowered. So I think that using ecosystem level reference points could be useful for combating this shifting baseline syndrome. So if we identify important aspects of the ecosystem that we care about, instead of just watching it, even if we have ecosystem indicators, watching it change through time, if we put a threshold, this is a threshold we don't want to go below. This is what we care about. This is where it's important that we not go below that. We put that threshold out there and we make a management change so that we are watching and trying to combat the shifting baseline syndrome. Okay, so here are the categories of existing or potential ecosystem level reference points that we have identified in our paper, and I will walk through them one at a time. So the first one is the category that we put together, ecosystem level reference points that are related to nonlinear dynamics and tipping points. So to walk you through tipping points, I'm going to walk you through the graph we have on the right. So on the x-axis, what we have here is environmental stress. So on the left are favorable conditions, and on the right are unfavorable conditions. So increased stress, unfavorable conditions. On the y-axis is the ecosystem state. So if you start up here at the top, we're in state A, and we'll call this a healthy ecosystem state. And so as we're going across, as the environmental stress increases, you see that the state slowly decreases and changes a little bit until you get to this tipping point here. And at the tipping point, what happens is you dramatically change to a second state. So this is state B. And the point about tipping points is, let's say you decrease the environmental stress a little bit and go back on this line here, you don't pop right back up to state A. You have to go all the way back to this second tipping point of recovery to get back up to state A. So tipping points are important. They exist, and they can be really hard to reverse. So it's something that we want to pay attention to in management if we want to avoid moving from state A to state B. So identifying tipping points or indicators that a tipping point is being approached would be great for management. So we have two ways we kind of look at this tipping point ideas from ecosystem level reference points. So the first one is, can we use statistics, like general statistics on an ecosystem, to give us an early warning that we're approaching a tipping point? And there's been a lot of research looking into this, and there's studies that suggest that there may be these early warning signals. And so some of the things that they found is increases in variance through time suggests that you're getting close to a tipping point. Critical slowing down or critical speed or speeding up. So this is either longer recoveries, which is more common, or occasionally faster recoveries from some sort of stressor. The other thing is flickering. So flickering back and forth between different ecosystem states might happen right before you hit a tipping point and move permanently or almost permanently to the second state. So there, as I said, there's been lots of research on this, and there are good examples of these statistical early warnings using mesocosms, using ecosystem models, and using simple ecosystems. We're still working on applying research to the more complex ecosystems that we see in the marine environment. And so there are questions about whether these kind of warning signals will be usable when you get to the complex marine environments. Okay. The other way you can look at tipping points is looking at ecosystem-specific thresholds. So if you have an ecosystem that you have good data from in the past, environmental data, fishing pressure, you can use those analyses and run statistical analyses specific for that ecosystem to identify an ecosystem-specific tipping point or threshold. And a good example of this is from Scott Large, who's up in New England Fisheries Science Center right now. And so they looked, it was an ecosystem in the Northeast, and used multivariate statistics to identify a combination of environmental pressures and fishing pressures where they would have a tipping point. And so they used factor analysis, which is similar to principal component analysis. So here in this graph, the x-axis is the fishing pressure, and the y is a mix of different environmental parameters. So the statistics pulled out a combination of environmental parameters or environmental pressures that had the biggest impact on the conditions of the ecosystem. And they did find that they were able to identify tipping points at a specific fishing pressure and specific environmental conditions. So this is a way of also looking at individual ecosystems. Why is it important? And so here's a study, Kelly et al. You can see I try to put the references on the right, and I'll provide them at the end if you want a little more information on these. Did an analysis that just looked at managing with and managing without thresholds and doesn't make a difference. And so let me tell you what this figure is showing. So on the x-axis, we have the degree of threshold use and management, and I will tell you what 1, 2, 3, and 4 mean in just a minute. And then on the y-axis, we have the success of the management action. So how successful was the management action? So the first category here is managers use a known threshold quantitatively to set targets and manage threshold variables. So you can see that's the most successful when you can quantitatively manage to those thresholds. The second one, category 2, managers used a known suspected threshold to manage without quantitative targets. So they even just suspected a threshold was there. And so with that threshold idea of a threshold in mind, managed, I guess, probably precautionary. The third one is managers did not recognize a threshold, but their actions did affect threshold variables. And the fourth one was managers do not recognize a threshold and their actions do not affect the threshold variables. So this was a meta-analysis across 31 data points and did show that statistically, the degree of threshold-based management was significantly correlated with outcome. All right, so here's at the end of each of my categories, I will give you the pros and cons for that category. So I think for this ecosystem tipping points category, the pros are it's important. We have climate change impacting our marine ecosystems, so understanding tipping points, I think, is really important. And any early warning of coming close to a tipping point would be a powerful rationale for management action. The cons are that first category I talked about, which was those general statistical early warning signs. They have not yet been shown to be consistent in complex systems. So there's more research needed on that. And then the thresholds, the second example on thresholds for multivariate statistics, it can be kind of difficult to interpret and know how to use those. I think for all of my categories, I do say thresholds and appropriate management responses are hard to identify. So that is where effort will be needed. Okay, the second category is ecosystem level reference points based on ecosystem productivity. So this first slide just talk a little bit about the theory behind this. So facts are fish biomass is directly dependent on the primary production of the ecosystem. So there is a maximum amount of fish biomass that can be sustainably removed from an ecosystem. So taking more biomass than that sustainable amount can lead to unhealthy ecosystem, and we've been calling that ecosystem overfishing. So there can be ways of setting up an ecosystem level reference point that's based on like a general understanding of ecosystem overfishing. And so this is based on some of the work Jason Link has done with Link and Watson in 2019, and they came up with 3 indexes that you can monitor to look for ecosystem overfishing. And what the most simple of these is the Ryther index, which is shown here, and it puts a maximum metric tons that can be removed per square kilometer per year. And they have put the statistics to identify thresholds. So they identified a threshold at about 1 metric ton and a second threshold at about a 4 metric ton. And they used global analyses of productivity and area to come up with these thresholds. So what's shown in these graphs here is Georges Bank and the Gulf of Maine. And you can see that Georges Bank had way too high removals of metric tons in about the 70s, dropped way down, and now we're getting down in the more acceptable level. In the Gulf of Maine, we still have it in this middle area that is higher than the 1 metric ton threshold, but lower than this 4. You can also find ecosystem level reference points that are more ecosystem specific. So can you come up with an ecosystem specific cap based on the characteristics of your ecosystem? And so these can be estimated in multiple ways. So those got 4 examples here in the bullets. So you can do a sum of the maximum sustainable yield across all your stocks, and then ecosystem level productivity would be about 75% of the sum of MSYs. So you can do it by taking your single species management and using it to identify an appropriate thresholds. It can be used as an estimate of primary production for your ecosystem. It can be estimated via aggregate production models. So single species reference points are often calculated using single species production models. You can do a similar analysis at the ecosystem level and get multi-species MSY, which that's what the MMSY is. And then you can also estimate via summation of catches or survey biomass if you have a data poor area. So in management use, the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council has mandated ecosystem caps for 2 of their ecosystems. And so the one we're going to talk about here is the Eastern Bering Sea. And so mandated, so required, is there's a 2 million metric ton cap for the Eastern Bering Sea. And this cap is interesting because, as you can see on the graph on your left, the total system cap is here in the bluish color. But many years, the sum of their single species catch limits are higher than the 2 million metric ton cap. And so when that happens, there has to be a discussion at the council level of which species are going to be fished below their single species catch limit. And so that it allows that discussion of trade-offs that happens. Research has shown that having this cap in place has led to more sustainable management through time in a changing climate. And the North Pacific Fishery Management Council folks, I've heard personal conversations like the cap and feel that it leads to more sustainable management. Okay, category 2, pros. The pros on this one are it's relatively easy to calculate and explain. It's in many cases very similar to single species reference points that many fishermen and managers are used to. So it might be more acceptable because of that. It can foster discussions of trade-offs across fisheries. At the ecosystem level, catches at the ecosystem level are more stable than the catches of those individual species through time, and it can be applicable in data-limited systems. The biggest con is that it can mean lower catch limits relative to single species management. So in that Bering Sea example, where we had the 2 million metric ton cap is less than that of the individual species added together, and that can be hard for fishermen to want to implement. Fishermen feel that in the United States, our fisheries management is very precautionary compared to their competitors in other parts of the world. And so convincing them to lower their catch even more can be a hard sell, to be honest. And then the other thing is it can sometimes simplify an ecosystem. And so looking at a stable catch can obscure food web changes or changes through time that are happening in the ecosystem. Category 3. So these are ecosystem level reference points based on ecosystem trophic information. So what is a trophic level? So again, I'm not sure who the audience is, so I'm going to just take a second and explain trophic level. Trophic level is the level at which what the species eats. So trophic level of 1 are your primary producers, so your plants or your even benthic detritus as they have here. The species that eat those plants would be trophic level 2. So these are your herbivores. Then the species that eat the plants are trophic level 3, and you head on up. And that's the general description of trophic level. So the idea of ecosystem level reference points based on trophic information, so the distribution of the biomass in your ecosystem and where it is on that trophic level can be used to give you information about your ecosystem. So one of the ways you can look at this is here we've got trophic level. So it would be 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4 across the x-axis. And the cumulative B is the accumulated biomass as you go across. So you start with your primary producers. And so in the marine environment, those are your phytoplankton. And so they don't have a lot of cumulative biomass. And then as you move up to like the herbivores, you get a huge jump up here, usually between about second and third trophic level. And then as you get to your higher apex predators, they also don't have as much biomass. And so you have this very consistent curve throughout all marine environments. And so where you switch from the curve going up to this curve is your inflection point. And the location of that inflection point can be used to tell you a little bit about your ecosystem. So we know that ecosystems respond in a consistent way to negative impacts. And so that shows you how this figure would change, this cumulative biomass figure would change as your ecosystem gets stressed. So your sum of biomass in the ecosystem is going to decrease. So you go from here to here, and then your where the fall it hits on the trophic level on the x-axis is also going to decrease. So you'll get that change. Sorry. So this could be used to create ecosystem level reference points. So you could identify what the current, cumulative biomass curve looks like for your ecosystem, and then say we really want to make sure our ecosystem does not change, does not perturb past a certain spot. So maybe set up a, less than one standard if you hit one standard deviation change and where you hit on the trophic level axis, then that is what you want to set up as your ecosystem level reference point. There's other trophic level potential ELRPs, which I mentioned here, which are a little bit simpler. So there's been suggestions to set up like a high trophic level indicator or an apex predator indicator. So what percentage of your biomass is in those upper level trophic levels? So one of these includes all high level predators, and the other one takes out those that are planktivores. And so it is a way to monitor that higher level in your ecosystem, which can let you know if there's what the fishing pressure is like. Okay, pros and cons of this. So some of the pros of these ecosystem level reference points based on trophic level would be you could theoretically track one indicator and have a good idea on the health or if your ecosystem is going through changes. It could be applicable to data limited situations. So you can do that cumulative biomass curve with fish catching information. So your what species catch or survey information. And it could also provide early warning of ecosystem level changes. The cons is I struggle a little bit, you may have seen, with explaining the cumulative biomass curve and how that changes in that inflection point location will impact your ecosystem. So I think it is a little bit harder to explain to fishermen, to managers. It can also potentially oversimplify complex interactions within your ecosystem. If you are using catch data to do your cumulative biomass curve, it can be confounded by management changes. So if there's some management change that maybe reduces the catch of lower trophic level stocks, it would change that curve. And so you need to make sure that any changes you are seeing are not due to changes in management or the fish being targeted. Okay. This is 4 out of 5. We're getting there. So the fourth one is ecosystem level reference points based on biodiversity. So again, the theory. So anybody who does ecology, you know a lot about biodiversity indices. So you have species diversity, you have richness, you have evenness. So what species diversity is, to refresh anybody who needs it, it's the number of different species present in a place and the relative abundance of each of those species. Richness is the number of species in an area, and then evenness is how even the abundance of those species are across the different species. So you could set up an ecosystem level reference point based on simple biodiversity indices. But we believe that it may be more important to track what species, not just what species are there or how many species are there, but what are their ecosystem functions. So we know that some species are more important than others. There are keystone species, and keystone species are a species on which other species in an ecosystem largely depend, such as if they were removed, the ecosystem would change dramatically. And so I have a picture here of sea stars. Robert Payne was the first person who identified keystone species as a thing. And when these predators are present, it has a huge impact on the ecosystem because they keep a species of mussel that will overtake an ecosystem and keep them in check. There's also foundational species, which are like coral reefs or kelps that are the foundation of an entire ecosystem. So what does this mean for potential ecosystem level reference points? So you could say we are really interested in the species diversity of our ecosystem and we want to know when that has changed. And you can set up an ecosystem level reference points based on maybe a certain standard deviation of change of your species diversity is when you're going to be concerned about your ecosystem. You can also look at functional diversity or functional redundancy. So if you have, as species move in or out of an ecosystem with a changing climate, as distribution shifts, you may want to make sure that you have functional redundancy at each level of the food web. So if you have a couple of herbivores that move out of the system and you're down to, not a whole lot of functional redundancy at that level in your food web, you may want to pay attention to that and maybe have more precautionary management where you have that low functional redundancy. So it's another thing we can track and potentially turn into an ecosystem level reference point. Through this slide in, since our paper came out, a new paper came out on sentinel species, and it fits really well here. A sentinel species would be a species that you can track that tells you what's going on in the ecosystem. And so it could be, instead of having to track, maybe cumulative biomass or something, maybe just tracking this one species will give you a good idea of what's going on your ecosystem. And so from this paper, they found that sentinel species, which are trophically linked and measured on short timescales, may be more effective at monitoring ecosystem change than other species. And they have other good information in here. So that's another thing to ponder. Are there sentinel species in your ecosystem? And could you set up an ecosystem level reference point based on that species and a level of change that's unacceptable, that you want to trigger a management change? Okay, so our summary for this category. So I really think looking at biodiversity and functional redundancy is important for ecosystem resilience, especially as we're going through a changing climate. As I said, it's important as species move into and out of an area, and it can capture important dynamics on ecosystem functional roles. The cons are you need to understand the ecosystem role of species. And so in some ecosystems, we know that better than in others. It can be harder to track, and you can get the same indicator value can be obtained via multiple species configurations. Okay, our final category is ecosystem level reference points that are focused on the human dimension. So a little bit of the background. We all know that humans are an important part of the ecosystem, so part of ecosystem-based fisheries management for sure. Fisheries management is really management of people, not of the fish. We're managing people behavior to manage the fish. Human behavior is complex, and so there's a lot of ways we could turn human dimension indicators into ecosystem level reference points. So a couple of potential ideas we had. So maybe you want to create an ELRP from economic indicators. So maybe there's a level of revenue. If there's more than a 20% change in revenue for the fishermen, that means something drastic is happening. And so we need to do some management change to help the fishermen not have this stress of this change in revenue. Or look at the diversity of their income. If you see hit a point where your fishermen in your region are dependent on one or two stocks of fish, that could be a little worrisome, as stocks could heat waves hit and stocks are impacted by that. You might want to do management intervention to try to figure out a way to diversify that reliance of the fishermen. Could also set up potential ecosystem level reference points looking at human well-being. I would also like to suggest there might be a way to, I would love to figure out a way to identify the trust of the users on the fisheries management itself. And so if that trust hits a threshold level, then we really need to change our management to figure out a way to get that trust back up. So as always, it would be hard to identify what are appropriate thresholds and management responses, but it could be as simple as looking at what it is now and identifying a threshold that's either a percent change or a standard deviation change. So you can identify when a big change has happened. Summary. So the pros of setting up some ELRPs on human dimensions is it acknowledges the human aspect of the ecosystems, and it helps to track economic or well-being aspects of the industries, which are key, are important. And cons are these indicators are not available at this time and harder to track. So obviously more research is needed on this category. All right, so you've seen this slide before. So hopefully over the last 35 minutes or so, I have convinced you of the potential benefits of ecosystem level reference points. I'm going to repeat these because I think it's important. So ecosystem level reference points help us monitor how ecosystems function at a higher level. They can provide early warnings of major changes that we miss if we're only looking at single species management. They can help instigate discussions around trade-offs and help us balance competing objectives in fisheries management. And they can improve our understanding of ecosystem changes and help with the shifting baseline syndrome, making sure we just don't let that ecosystem shift through time and not stop it or acknowledge that. So next steps, the important stuff. So we are lucky here at NOAA Fisheries. We have ecosystem status reports in almost every U.S. region. And all of these are updated on a regular basis. Some of them are annual, some of them are not quite annual. We would like to push if there's a way to get them annual, that'd be great. But these ecosystem status reports could be useful for identifying what the ecosystem level reference points might be, what are the important indicators in your region, and what are conditions that you don't want to hit. So what are some of those thresholds you may want to put into place? Ecosystem status reports can also be an on-ramp for implementing ELRPs once you've identified them. So I do admit more research could be useful on all of the potential ELRPs and existing ELRPs that I discussed in this webinar today, but I do believe that we have enough information to implement them now. I think the way forward might be to identify simple ELRPs with non-controversial management responses as a way to introduce the idea of ELRPs and the concept and open the door for maybe future ELRPs that might be a little bit more controversial. So I think there needs to be some outside the box thinking about how do we identify some non-controversial ways to start at this. So back to my take homes. ELRPs are a great step towards ecosystem-based fisheries management. I've said this a couple times. We have enough information and reasons to begin implementing them now. But again, I really want managers to think outside the box. So what really matters for your ecosystem? Where are things that you would definitely like, conditions you don't want to get to? So that can help you set up where you might want to put an ecosystem level reference point. Too much information here, but this is all those pros and cons on one slide in case you want to have them at some point to look at, because I know everybody's so thrilled with this information. You may want that all in one place. References that I mentioned throughout the slides for future information. And then thank you. I appreciate your time and your attention. And here is my email, and you're more than welcome to email me if you have any questions. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Wendy. Go ahead and, let's see, go ahead and put your webcam on. And audience, this is your host, Lisa from NOAA Library. We have lots of time to answer your questions, and we would love to hear them. So please type them in the Q&A chat. It's on your right side of the screen. It's different from the regular chat, and I will upload them to the screen for our speaker. Just remember, please, that your first name will show up on screen with your question, but you can ask questions anonymously if you choose this option. Though the speaker will not be able to follow up after the webinar. We did get a question in the chat here, so I'm going to go ahead and read that to you. You can read it, you might see it in the audience chat. This is from Yvonne, who asked the question, what do you think about the possibility of combining different types of ELRPs? It seems like two or more of these in combination with each other might be more useful than just one alone.
I think that's a great idea. I'm pretty open-minded about what could be an ELRP, and I think it will be ecosystem specific. So if for your ecosystem, your management regime, if you think there is a great combination that goes across those categories that makes sense for you, yeah, why not? We put them into categories just to try to make sense of what's out there now. But yeah, go for it.
Excellent. We did get another question in our Q&A, and let me put that on screen. This one's from Corrine, who asks, if these thresholds are crossed and management change is triggered, are management actions pre-planned or discussed in real time? Is there a specific timescale for management action? And do ELRPs speed up management action?
Really good questions, Corinne. So the idea is that there would be some sort of management action pre-planned. I think you could write them to be pretty squishy in the beginning as we get used to the concept of ecosystem level reference points. So as I said, they could be something like you cross a threshold, your diversity of species decreases 10% or something. So then we want to increase our monitoring of the ecosystem, understand what's going on. But the type of actions need to be pre-planned. I'm afraid if you just say some management action will be taken, that's not going to really lead to anything. I know this is a concern for managers because the conditions when that tipping point or when the threshold are crossed will be important. And so there will have to be a balance of identifying what is an appropriate management action and what's an appropriate amount of squishiness in that answer. So this will require some bigger conversations. I think there should be a specific time scale for the management action. So within whatever's appropriate for your change. And I think ELRPs could speed up management action. If you identify when something happens, the response will be why, then you have a lot of those analyses done ahead of time. And yes, I think it could definitely speed up management action. I think I got all your questions. Thank you. Good
Yep,
questions.
thank you. Dina asked a question in the chat, and she asks, for tipping points, you mentioned simple versus complex systems. How are these differentiated?
Good question. I don't know that there's a specific, this one is simple or not. It's kind of a continuum, but there are some ecosystems or mesocosms they can set up that have like an apex predator, two or three species at the next level, two or three species. And so they aren't as complex as you get like in marine environment. So the picture I showed of a food web in the Bering Sea has so many different species, so many interactions, so many different lines going here and there and everywhere, and omnivores, that's a complex system. And there are some more simple systems that does that help? I don't know that I nailed that question, but that's the idea.
Dina, let us know. Meanwhile, I'm going to show another question from Anonymous. Do you think there's a risk that by pursuing non-controversial management responses, it could make it more difficult to then transition to more challenging management responses paired with ELRPs?
Ooh, that one. Unfortunately, I'm not the quickest thinker, so that one I'm going to have to ponder. And I'd like to. Unfortunately, you didn't give me your name, so I think that is a risk. Yeah, I think you'd have to really look at your ecosystem and your fishermen and know, kind of have an idea of what's would be acceptable there. If you think you can start with a bigger management response, a more probably more appropriate management response, to be honest. Go for it. I think there is a risk there, so I will give you that.
Excellent. And by the way, Dina responded. She said, thank you. Yes, a continuum makes sense. We got another question from Dan in the chat, which asks, have you talked about dynamic reference points that adjust to changing ecosystem productivity, for example, based on PDO or something, or shocks such as a marine heat waves?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So there's a lot of discussion here at NOAA Fisheries on dynamic ocean management, which is where you are adjusting your management in response to what you're seeing in the ocean. So the example that everybody that started a lot of this was Elliot Hazen's work, where you look at what conditions might put, fishing gear and swordfish in the same area, and so you might dynamically close certain areas based on where you think the swordfish might be. And so, yes, that idea of dynamic ocean management, I think, is amazing, and I think we should pay more attention to it and see where it's useful. So you're saying now take that and create dynamic reference points that change based on conditions. Okay, so single species management is talking about moving towards dynamic reference points that adjust what a single species has as a reference point in a changing climate. I think you could easily do that for ecosystems. So if set up, let's say, I'm just going to pick one category, an ecosystem cap based on the productivity of your ecosystem, and you are able to monitor that productivity through time, yes, you could set up a dynamic ecosystem level reference point based on that productivity. So yes, great idea.
Thank you. Oops. There we go. Roger asked the question. Thanks for the presentation, Wendy. Lots of theory and ideas. What kind of things would you do to begin setting this in motion? Who would develop and test the new indicators and reference points? Any clear next steps for you?
Good question. For me personally, I would like to dig a little deeper into, so as you said, we put up a lot of theories and ideas, but no real concrete must happen next steps. So I would like to really look into more of the possibilities and maybe have a couple sessions with some really smart people. Please send me an email if you're interested, where we try to think outside the box on maybe what are some ecosystem level reference points we can do as an initial test. And if there's any ecosystems where you think it would be a really good idea to test it. So I do think we need to try to implement some in some regions soon. And so really thinking about how to do that, and ties to some of the earlier questions. Do we want to start with a non-controversial one, or is there an area where we can do something that is more controversial? So I haven't had the time yet, but I really like to have some brain power to sit down and think about that. As I said, the existence of ecosystem status reports at each region is great and a great place to start. So we can look at what indicators are there, if there's any indicators we think are missing, and then just what is important. So are there ecosystems that we don't want to get to? So not just what we want our ecosystem to be, but what do we want to avoid, I think will help us in identifying what some of those potential ecosystem level reference points could be. But good question. I appreciate that.
Thank you. I'm going to give it another minute to see if we get any questions. And while we're waiting, I just want to remind everybody I'm sending the link right now. This has been a really fantastic chat, and I want to make sure other people who couldn't join us today get to watch this. So if you know of anyone who might be interested, please send them to the NOAA Library YouTube channel, and I will upload this video in just a couple of hours. Oh, we did get some questions. Let me quickly grab them.
Lisa,
Okay.
I'm sorry, Lisa, while you're doing that, just before we go on to the next questions, I just want to remind folks our next presentation is July 10th, second Wednesday of the month, same time. And we'll be hearing from Jennifer Dopowski from our climate program office. And she's going to be talking about EBFM in the context of the Climate and Fisheries Adaptation Program, which is a partnership with our NOAA Research Office as well as Fisheries. So pass that on and you'll see notices about that, but that's July 10th at 3 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you, Peg. We did get this question from Robert, who asks, following Roger's question, do you have a sense of what types of management actions might be linked to these ecosystem level reference points?
So yeah, I'll start with the obvious, is if you have an ecosystem cap, then obviously the management action, if you reach that cap, is to cut down on the amount of fish removals in the total fish removals in an ecosystem. So that's a simple one of what the obvious management action is. Thinking through some of the other categories, so I don't know if you could tell, but I really like the idea of looking at that functional redundancy. And so if you have an ecosystem where the species moving in and out of that ecosystem leave an part of the ecosystem where you don't have high functional redundancy, I think we should then really try to maybe reduce the fishing pressure if it's a fish species on that level. I talked to someone earlier today, was talking about their ecosystem, and they think there's been a decrease in those apex predators. So an obvious one might be to start tracking your biomass of apex predators or the size distribution of your apex predators. And then if you see the shrinking go past a certain trigger or threshold, then you change your management to protect more of those big fish. So I think, yeah, the management action should be one that makes sense for the change that you're tracking.
Great. It looks like that's the last question. So I'm going to change the scene here. Thank you so much, Wendy. And Peg, did you have any last comments?
No, I don't. Thanks, Lisa. I just want to thank Wendy and her co-authors. Wonderful presentation, very clear and concise, and we appreciate everyone's questions and look forward to seeing you on July 10th.